Hey there, this is Andre Darmanin, formerly of the Urban Equity Chats webcasts, and now I've rebranded to the Global Conversations. So why Global Conversations? I wanted to have a conversation with equity practitioners from all over the world, uh, from the UK to Asian countries to Australia and far beyond, and expand that conversation talking to equity practitioners about the issues within their organization and how do they bring equity, inclusion, and belonging to their organizations and advancing those areas themselves. So with this conversation and with this webcast, I'm bringing a different perspective to this webcast, and more so, I'm bringing a co-host, as you see here, Preeya Rateja. And Preeya and I will just have a little chit chat about what we bring to the table and what we'll bring to the conversations with our equity practitioners and leaders. So Preeya, we've known each other for about a year. We followed each other on LinkedIn, and when I had this conversation with you about your career, and how we paralleled in terms of doing our master's of public admin program, landed in the same areas, and we have the same common interests. And then I asked you, I said, hey, you know what? It was just kind of a snap decision. I said, you would be perfect for being a co-host. This is something I've never done and I never thought of, but it was just one of those decisions. It was like almost like a natural fit. Like, I don't want to say match made in heaven, but it's almost kind of like that, right? So Preeya, I mean, I've rambled on. So, just tell the world, tell the audience, who you are, what you're all about and whatnot. And, the floor is yours, and we can have the conversation a little bit further as you talk about yourself.
You. Well, first of all, thank you for that amazing introduction and a little bit about our relationship and how this has come to fruition. So I'm really excited, first of all, for the invite. And I'm so happy to accept that. Being a co-host here is going to be fantastic. And I can see I'm already, excited about it. In terms of bringing a different perspective, I think that I have a really strong background. I started out in community grassroots organizations. That's sort of how I started out my career. And over time, as I would like to say I grew up and I started to do different things with my life. And I started to move into working with the violence against women sector, or gender-based violence, as we say now. I moved into working more with men who offend and those who offend. So I wanted to see more of a holistic sort of approach and more of a holistic framework in terms of justice and the justice system. I started out, at the University of Toronto doing my degree in criminology and sociology, but I actually started at a community college level. So I really started from like a very local, very small sort of local perspective, and really then bloomed into something that was a little bit more global, and looking at it from that context. So coming from, Calgary in Alberta, then coming out to Toronto and a bigger city and more of a sort of a metro sort of a place is where I started to sort of really grow. And then I went to York University, where I took the Master's in Public Policy Administration Law program, and also did a graduate diploma in Justice Administration. I did that while I was working, which was also something that was really important in terms of having the work experience and really taking that academic part of it and having that as part of my work, and using that real life experience. So then moving into the justice system, I started to work with offenders. So that was where I started going into the public service realm. And woven through all of that was doing anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism work. And it's something that, was interwoven in everything, in every aspect of everything that I did. And looking at the evolution of that work, starting from, the late 1990s into where we are now, and then seeing how some things really haven't changed and have maybe different names to it, but where there has been some real change, and looking at that from more of a global perspective. That is something that I feel like I've been able to witness, particularly from a social justice perspective. So I think that's something that I really do bring on to the table, and looking at what that looks like from a human rights perspective, as well as I've had some experience working in that area, having those sorts of roles in terms of public policy, looking at advising roles, and doing that within a community right at the grassroots frontline level, to strategic advisory sort of positions. So, yeah.
I mean, that experience, I don't know why I didn't unmute myself, but that experience altogether, that's the experience that I'm looking for to add to the conversations, because
Mm.
we're going to have conversations with, well, like I mentioned, global equity practitioners who have a different perspective, because we are in such a globalized world. There's such interconnectivity, but because also the fact that there's cultural differences in how equity and inclusion are addressed within those types of organizations. We want to hear those voices and those challenges that they've addressed and overcome.
Mhm.
And even with your perspective, you've had your own challenges that you've had to overcome within your, with your lived experiences. And so have I, right? So that's why when we've personally shared those stories with each other, this is something that we're going to bring. This is our whole heart conversation that we're bringing to these global conversations, to this webcast, and with the groups of people that we're going to be interviewing as our guests. And like these, especially given the fact that you, especially with your justice background, I mean, we're talking about justice as in a matter of fairness. What does fairness
Mhm.
look like? What does equity look like? How do we
Mhm.
include these populations? Like you mentioned, you fought for for anti-racism. You dealt with Black and Indigenous communities. And of course, looking at your background too, from your CV, uh, you even dealt with South Asian communities and other communities, right? So
Mhm.
so you have that wealth of experience understanding communities and what they, and how they address situations. Because one of the things what we forget is that we like to generalize and not fully understand what these cultures are all about, because cultural differences is what makes our world tick and what makes our world go around. So, these are the types of things that I like to hear. And this is why I brought you on. And I'm really thankful that you agreed to this. And I'm looking forward to what we're going to have in this next season. I'm anything else you want to add to this? Because we can probably go on forever on this.
I just wanted to add, like, one of the other things that I was just thinking about too is what other thing that I really bring to this table is that I've also worked in areas which are very non-traditional, in the sense of I've been in the military. I was in the Canadian Armed Forces for 6.5 years. I recently retired. Again, working in backgrounds which were law enforcement, working in areas that, traditionally, particularly women like me, women of color, women of South Asian background, traditionally didn't enter those sorts of fields. And now having, several years experience working in those areas, and those, again, like, particularly if you're looking at working in those sorts of fields, bringing that kind of experience and recognizing what those challenges are, particularly from that perspective, coming in with this sort of intersectionality, is also something that I think is really important to have those sorts of conversations. So again, it's becoming, I don't think you ever become really comfortable with that kind of discomfort. And I think it's about challenging a little bit of that as well. So I am a little bit excited about being able to bring that to the table, and hopefully bring that to the forefront, because I think those are issues that are sometimes things that people kind of hesitate to talk about, or are a little bit concerned about talking about. And I don't shy away from that, as you can see from the kind of background that I have. I'm kind of the one who, you know, puts myself into situations and then worries about, about things later, about I'm gonna manage and deal with things. And I think that's just the unique
Exactly.
sort of perspective that I bring. So I do that in sports too. That's just who I am, right?
Yeah.
I decided to go into boxing. I decided to go into these things that just sort of push the envelope a little bit. Let's just say.
Hey, I'm all for pushing the envelope. I think being in this type of work, you can't you can't do this work without pushing the envelope, period.
Mhm.
You have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And it's not just about who the people, who our clients are or who we work with, et cetera. It's about ourselves too. And, the thing is that in doing this work, it is most important that we check our biases. We learn from each other. These are the types of things that we need to discuss more. And I'm sure there's, the guests that we're going to have are going to be talking about this. And that's something that we will talk about. Like, for instance, the very first episode, which will be coming up soon, we will be talking about inclusive leadership. What does inclusive leadership look like?
Mm.
What are the characteristics? What are the traits? How do we differentiate between an inclusive leadership style and a transformational leadership style, or even a servant leadership style, right? So these are and of course, these are the types of conversations I like to have, is because, you know, we talk about a lot of these terms. We talk about, even for our area, we talk about, land acknowledgements. And I know I had a conversation in the Urban Equity Chats webcast where we talked about, the performative statements that continuously occur because without any action. And that one of
Mhm.
them are those land acknowledgement types of statements. It's like, okay, we say them, but at the same time, it's like, hey, what are we doing about it? Right.
Right. Right.
And the other thing too is, one of the things I want to talk about too is the nomenclature. And one of the things we had a conversation about when you were like, your eyes lit up when I talked about the global majority, right?
Mm.
We're so constantly talking about BIPOC, and we're talking about, we've talked about visible minorities for so long. And,
Right.
in the UK, they talk about BAME, right? And so these are the, British Asian minority ethnic group. That's what the title is. So these are the things that we need to change the conversation as well, right? We
Mhm.
need to, we not only for changing the conversation, which is what we're doing, but also the
Right.
action, right? And
Mhm.
that's the most critical, that's the most important part of why these conversations are happening, and how we can progress from this. Because, like, we have your typical, the typical interviews with guests and whatnot, and they bring, their experiences and stuff. But I also want to bring the lived experience to these conversations, because, your lived experiences, although we have some similarities in our lived experiences, we also have a lot of differences with our lived experiences, and not everyone has the same experience. And that's why we are unique. And that's why these global conversations need to happen. So I'm just going to leave you with the last words, and then we'll end this conversation. So, Priya, um, any last words?
No, well, I was just going to say, I think that you've, said it quite well. And I think one last thing I want to say is, with when you look at the way that the world has become a smaller place in terms of how economies and markets have been affected, more so and more, less apart and more together. and we look at how things like technology have been brought people together more and more, and made the world much more of a place that people are brought together instead of far apart. I think these conversations must be had. I don't think they're an option anymore. And I think this is why what we're doing here is extremely important. And I think that this is something that we can't ignore, and it needs to happen. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me to become a co-host. I'm really excited for our future conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Preeya. And that concludes our pre-episode into the second season, or really the first season of Global Conversations. So with that, thank you, Preeya, once again, and I look forward to having you as my co-host and for our future conversations. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.